Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined. I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and my guest today is Raina Lipsitz. Raina, could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Raina Lipsitz and very happy to be here.
Thank you so much for coming on. So we're going to be talking about your new book, which came out last year from Verso, The Rise of a New Left. And the subtitle is How Young Radicals Are Shaping the Future of American Politics. So congratulations on the book. And
Thank you.
I should say we knew each other just a little bit in college.
It's true.
And well, what were the origins of deciding that this was a book as opposed to some other, I know you read a lot of magazine pieces.
Sure.
How did this come to be a book and like a coherent thing?
Well, I'm flattered that you think it's coherent. That's good news to me. I think that what happened is that I got the opportunity to interview Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez twice for The Nation magazine. And after I did those interviews, one was about a week before she won the primary, and then one was after she'd won the primary, but before she was officially sworn in as a congresswoman. And so the original concept really was to do a book that was more tightly focused on her as a person. And then, funnily enough, there turned out to already be about 7 books in the works that were about AOC. Or had some variation of, the AOC generation in the title. So I talked about it with my Verso editor, and for a number of reasons, we kind of decided to shift the focus away from her as a person, as a personality, and make it kind of broader. And one of the reasons I wanted to do that was because I really was more interested in the people on the ground who are fueling this rise of a new left, and not as much the political celebrities, although she was a very interesting person to meet. And I have, tremendous interest in and respect for her and people like Bernie Sanders and all of these sort of major national figures. But I wanted to write a book that was more about the people on the ground.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting because one of the questions I wanted to discuss was sort of like, what's the interplay between individual charismatic people, leaders versus like larger forces unfolding, and how to, if the charismatic leader doesn't bubble up from the bottom, like how does that change the movement? Okay, so you met AOC before she won the primary in 2018. Was it Crowley? Was that the name of
Yes, yeah.
the
Before
sitting
she took out
representative?
Joe Crowley.
Right. And she's obviously become a huge star since then. What struck you about her when you met her the first time?
She's about a little less than a decade younger than I am, I guess, than we are. And she is really, really poised. She struck me as just unusually calm and confident, and unusually politically gifted, really. I mean, that's sort of what people said, I think, about JFK at the time. And she really just has tremendous political skills. She's very fast on her feet. She can answer questions. There's no pause. There's no hesitation. And she is just really, really sharp and impressive in that way. And the people in her office, as I think I wrote in the book, were clearly just completely enamored of her. She has this tremendous ability to inspire people and attract devoted staff members.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so stepping back a little bit, there was sort of a hinge point in late 2008, early 2009 with the financial crisis and the Great Recession and Obama's election. And there were sort of a left and a right movement that emerged reacting to that. And the right movement was the Tea Party. And
Right.
people don't talk about the Tea Party that much anymore, but they've sort of like taken over the GOP. And Trump is very much, he wasn't a Tea Party guy, but like Trumpism is sort of an outgrowth of various Tea Party movements. And then the
Yeah.
left movement was Occupy, or at least the main left movement was Occupy. And I remember thinking at the time, like, especially after the GOP did so well in the 2010 election, this is like the left once again, like shooting itself in the foot. Like the GOP is like on the march. These crazies are like, you know, 80 of them just got elected to Congress. And meanwhile, like left activists are like sitting in the cold in parks and like, discussing like the rules about which peanut butter jar to use, and doing this like people's microphone thing where they're like, it just seemed like such a like waste of energy and everything, and so it sort of fizzled away. um and you like you would think, or I don't know if you would think, it seemed like you had this huge um example of like the capital class like royally screwing up and then not getting punished, and then the country is much worse off because of their mistakes, and then the like political reaction to that was like hard right, and that didn't
Right.
that was strange. And then fast forward to 2016, in the aftermath of Trump's election and Bernie's campaign and his failure to win the nomination and Hillary's defeat, there was this huge like change, like energy shift, like tons of people suddenly got interested in far left politics for the first time, and it was like a holdover from the 2008 2009 time or something. So I don't know exactly where I'm going with this, but it seems somewhat strange that like Trump's awfulness is what
Mhm.
inspired a lot of young people to like get involved in politics, and especially socialist politics. But like Trump was basically a down the line Republican on economic issues, and even was like somewhat softer than like the Paul Ryan wing, because he realized that cutting Social Security and Medicare would be bad
A
politics. And
bridge
so
too
he,
far. Yeah,
yeah, so he
exactly.
should, because he shied away from that. But like it wasn't the so Trump was more like a cultural shock, I think, than like an economic shock. But then that like 2016 is like the turning point, and Bernie plays into this as well. I don't even know where I'm going with this question, but it's like,
Well, I think if I can, not to talk over you, but
jump in, please.
I mean, yeah, no, you made a lot of good points. And I think one thing that came up in my book, especially when I was speaking with Jonathan Smucker, who runs Pennsylvania Stands Up, a group in Pennsylvania that he and his wife co-founded. And something that we were discussing is that a lot of these people who became sort of drivers of the Bernie campaigns, particularly in 2016, but also in 2020, were veterans of Occupy. And some of them were people who thought, who had learned some lessons from Occupy, right? So a lot of what you were just describing, that there was the movement itself, I think people did still, they saw a lot of value in, and it did have an impact on our culture. I mean, it introduced phrases like the 1%, and it did sort of lay
Hmm.
a groundwork for framing and for a sort of understanding, a class analysis that then people embraced maybe several years later. So part of it, I think, is that the left was during Occupy, during that time you're describing, was watching the right seize actual power within our government and thinking, oh shit, we have to catch up to that. Maybe we
Right.
need to also intervene in the electoral realm, and also just kind of broaden our idea of what a cohesive movement is and how we're going to go about, enacting the policies we want to see. I do agree with you that Trump was a bizarre figure, a galvanizing figure for a lot of reasons, and I do think that he actually, in some ways, was not as bad as his predecessors in the Tea Party movement. Right? I mean, he didn't certainly wasn't as effective in certain ways. He didn't get he wasn't able to undo, Social Security. He didn't even try to undo
No,
Social
he's
Security.
weighed in to actually just in the past week or so
Right.
saying it would be, the people who are now in charge of the House GOP are basically like the people who came up through the Tea Party,
Right.
and their only agenda seems to be like what the Tea Party agenda was 12
Exactly.
years
Yeah.
ago. And Trump is like, no, don't cut, because Trump, I mean, there's so many funny things about Trump, but one is that because he's not a politician and he doesn't have any actual beliefs, he's just like more of like a normal person, where the
Right.
normal person would be like, yeah, don't cut Medicare and Social Security. Everyone likes that. Whereas like the ideologues
Yeah.
in the GOP are like, no, we must cut it because the takers are overwhelming the makers. But he's just like, no, that's stupid.
Right. And I think Trump, I mean, as we've seen in the last few years, I think Trump actually has a better sense than most people in his party of what is popular, what
Yeah.
people want. He certainly was the most popular Republican. I think still is the most popular Republican since Reagan, by polling. And,
Hmm.
so he obviously hit on a winning formula, or at least one that won in 2016.
Right.
Just to return to some of what you were saying before, just in sort of partial defense of Occupy, I do think that some of what they were doing, it was consistent with the politics, right? They wanted to be leaderless, they wanted to be more democratic, and actual democracy is it's difficult to do, and it doesn't yield this kind of charismatic leader figure that you were talking about. If you're really listening to everybody and doing things by consensus, it's a harder way to run an organization, and it has its pluses and its minuses. And then I think part of why Trump was so galvanizing is that younger people and people who'd been exposed in or involved with Occupy saw him as somebody who could have been avoided, should have been avoided, certainly shouldn't have won in 2016, and would not have won if there were a functioning and effective Democratic Party.
Right. And this is the Bernie would have won meme that emerged after the 2016 general, which I agreed with. But I also thought anyone aside from Clinton would have won, like Martin O'Malley would have won, and all, there was like 3 or 4 other guys who were sort of no names who faded
Right.
away. It was just Clinton's unique toxicity and political, you know, total like tone deafness. Is one of the, is the main reason Trump won, I think. And he won in this very like close triple bank shot sort of way. Okay, the reason I maybe brought some of this stuff up is like were these things sort of historically inevitable in some, not like fully inevitable, but like, okay, let's say Bernie Sanders had never been born. And then Trump still, so then Trump won, but there was no like strong left challenge and not this movement identified with him personally that galvanized. Or let's say Hillary Clinton had, gone to campaign in Wisconsin and like
Right.
flipped the 3 states and had narrowly won, what would have happened to the movement that Bernie helped inspire? Like, so was it just like this weird historical contingency based on the bizarre figure of Trump that caused these things to happen? Or is there some, because I don't know, I feel like the Marxist understanding of history is more like forces, dialectics, and not like one important person is
Right.
the key,
Right.
the key figure inspiring people.
Yeah, I certainly don't think it was only Trump. I mean, he's the most visible kind of symbol of all of that. But I think what I say in the book is that there are a lot of generational shifts, and people our age and younger than us were fed up on a number of levels. I interviewed so many people who are younger than me for this book, and it was really striking how much they'd been through. Right, they'd been through 2 entirely distinct cycles of Black Lives Matter, where it was like, 2013 to 2016 roughly, and then a whole new wave in 2020. And they'd been through 2 major global recessions. They'd been through a pandemic and a worsening climate crisis. And as we're seeing today, really disgusting and horrifying levels of gun violence, which actually have been pretty stable for a long time, but are really bad
Mm-hmm.
in this country. So I think people were watching their lives just sort of get worse and worse by these really material measures. A lot of people are now, for the first time ever, going to be worse off than their parents, are already worse off than their parents, can't afford homes, can't afford to have children, have no stability in their jobs, or their careers are sort of, stuck in various dead end positions, or failing to advance in a way that keeps pace with inflation, or just sort of their general expectation of the trajectory their lives would have. So that kind of frustration, I think, is really what was fueling it, where the people watching things kind of fall apart and watching the ways in which their lives were deviating from the lives they expected and in some ways were promised, right? I mean, you do grow up hearing, if you go to college and you work really hard and
Mm-hmm.
you get an education and you pursue a certain path, you're going to be all set. You're going to have a good life. And that is like increasingly not true. It's not true for a lot of people. It was not true for a lot of people before, and it's extra not true for people now. So I think that's a large part of it.
Mm-hmm. So how much credit do you give to Bernie specifically. Like, let's say Bernie had stayed the mayor of Burlington, Vermont, for 50 years or whatever, or had become like a professor at, Middlebury or something, and there hadn't been that galvanizing campaign and movement. Do you think things would have played out very differently?
Yes and no. I mean, I think that those forces I just described would still be there, and that frustration would still be
Hmm.
there. That's another thing I discussed actually with Jonathan Smucker in the book was the idea of how important are candidates. And we were talking in the context of Jess King's race in Pennsylvania. She was basically a Bernie-crat who ran in a deep red district, and she came very close, but then was redistricted and then lost by a large margin ultimately. But she was a really great candidate, and so kind of personally compelling that she was able to make inroads in a really conservative part of Pennsylvania in a way that nobody thought, that most Democrats, mainstream Democrats, could not do and hadn't done. And she
Hmm.
was able to do that. And Jonathan said, and I agree with this, it really isn't just the platform. You do need that kind of magic, that alchemy that Bernie had, that people like Bernie and Jess King and AOC had, of being personally, maybe likable is the wrong word, because plenty of people did not find Bernie likable. I mean, I did, but a lot of people didn't. Um, but something compelling, something that people want to watch you, or something they find interesting about you, and that's a very difficult. You can't you can teach some of those skills, you can't teach all of them. So you know, it's a real, it's a question that we're still, I think, kind of figuring out as a movement, that how do you get, and DSA in New York City, Democratic Socialists of America, I think has made really impressive progress in identifying people who are really particularly good candidates, who are from the born and raised in the districts they're trying to represent, are people of color, have interesting life stories, are able to speak in a compelling way. And that's not an accident. I mean, they've really been made a deliberate effort to recruit those people.
Hmm.
Um, but it's a tough thing to find. I mean, it's just not something that everybody, no matter how well-meaning and ideologically consistent they are, has or can do.
Yeah, it's some factor of charisma or something that, yeah, it does seem, yeah, you can't fake it, and
No.
you can try, and some people seem to have it and others don't. So the title is "The Rise of a New Left." How is this different from various old versions of the left in American history?
So, as many people pointed out when the book came out, the new left was a phrase that came out in the 60s in reference to a group of young student radicals at the time. I should know more about that than I actually do. I'd say that the sort of biggest difference now is that the left that exists today is trying to marry that economic and class analysis to a kind of identitarian, I don't want to say identitarian, that's the wrong word, but a focus on representation and inclusion that didn't really exist in a previous era. So people like the leaders of Justice Democrats, for example, they're walking this kind of funny line of being, they were very pro Bernie, they were very much aligned with the Bernie campaign, but they talked a lot about how we need fewer old white men in government, and we need more women and people of color. And that's not necessarily a contradiction. You could say, like, in a given field, Bernie still represented the interests of women and people of color better than anybody else. That's what I believe, and I agree with them about that. But it sounds sort of inconsistent to a lot of people from the outside. And it's something that we're still kind of figuring out, right? Like, what does that actually mean? Does it mean you can never have white male candidates? I don't really think that's what it means, but it does mean that there's a new focus on inclusion and really making sure that everybody has an opportunity to lead and to be part of a recognized face of a movement.
Hmm. Can you talk more about Justice Democrats and that group and how that emerged? Because you interviewed the founder or co-founder of that
I
group.
did. Yeah. Yeah. They're really interesting people. They're all younger than me, but actually not that much younger. They're all like 5 to 7 years younger, something like that. And they came out of the Bernie campaign. I mean, that's where many of them met, and they were trying to seize the moment. And I think they have in a lot of ways. I mean, they've had a decent amount of electoral success, uh, put a small, but a very small but important sort of group of people in Congress, known as the Squad. And I think that what's really interesting to me is that they are being presented as this kind of these new radicals. And a lot of what they talk about is New Deal era politics. It's just basically, we need FDR back. We need massive federal investments in things like combating climate change and creating a federal jobs program and that sort of thing. But it's a return to a time that we've seen where this country was able to do those things, did put in a massive amount of public money into things like public works programs and got people back to work and got the country back on its feet. They're marrying it to these new set of concerns, right? Like they have the Green New Deal, which is specifically about climate. But I think it's very impressive what they've done. I think it's very smart what they're doing. I don't know. I have some concerns about how, and until there's a critical mass in Congress, it doesn't feel like, well, I guess it could go one of two ways. Either they need to get way more people in Congress and have a serious block, a serious squad block that's more than, I think it's now 8 people. And they might do that. They might be on track to do that. Or they're going to have to get better at sort of freedom caucus, adopt the tactics of the hard right and more successfully and effectively pressure Democratic leadership on their issues.
Yeah. And I saw at least 1 or 2 people saying, when the Freedom Caucus holdouts did this huge thing where they refused to vote for Kevin McCarthy and it went to like 14 ballots or whatever, they were very intransigent. I saw some people saying, the left should have done this in 2018 with Pelosi and like put some real demands in, and other people pushing back saying, well, this has made like the GOP look like a laughing stock and that they don't know what the hell they're doing and they can't, 5 extreme people now seemingly have the whip hand in the Congress. So I guess it depends on how what the House Republicans are able to do at this point to see whether the strategy of a very small extreme group using it, throwing its weight around, whether that works or not.
Yeah. And I also think it depends on the demands, right? I mean, what do the extremists in the GOP want? They want to gut Social Security. That's not something that the majority of the American people want. And the more they hear what that actually means, the less they want it. Now, the difference with the left is that the things the quote unquote extreme left wants are extremely popular. They have very widespread public support. And, people do want that stuff. So I think that that's a very key difference. And I think that if you did it skillfully, you could exercise the same kind of power that the right has in Congress, but do it in a way that has public buy-in, public support.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's talk about the Green New Deal and the framing around that, the branding, and also what has transpired over the past 2 years. And so the name, Biden had the Build Back Better agenda, and then that was radically pared down, and a lot of it was thrown out. But a lot of the climate stuff stuck around. It was in this final bill that they did, manage to pass late in the game that I think they called the Inflation Reduction Act. But it seems like, and I don't know the exact details because there were so many changes, it was so confusing, but it seemed like this was a big investment in green energy technologies, and it included some, to get Joe Manchin on board, it had to include some SOPs to like West Virginia coal interests and other, dirty energy interests. But like, how are the people who push for the Green New Deal, how are they thinking about that legislation, which was, came out after, or was passed after your book was published, so you weren't able to cover it, and sort of happened extremely quickly, and everyone thought that it was all, that it was sunk, and that it came together very quickly and was passed. And
right.
So are the Green New Deal people happy to take like a half a loaf, or are they saying this was just, this was nothing?
I think that the best statement I read in the wake of all of that was the statement that Sunrise put out, which is, and Sunrise is very closely aligned with Justice Democrats. A lot of the people in leadership are the same or have relationships with each other. So those groups sort of came out of the same movement and small cadre of leadership. But my point is that they issued a statement that said, this is historic, it's major investments in combating climate change. It's very important that it got through, and it's really insufficient. And here's why. And they kind of laid out why. And they said, and this is what we need to keep fighting for. I personally was tremendously disappointed in how Build Back Better went, because in the initial, it's hard to, the timeline got really confusing in a lot of ways, but what got cut out of it, a lot of it was, childcare. It was things that people really need and that we've been talking about and fighting for literally for decades, literally for 50 years. So I think what got cut out of that bill it's really a shame and it's really despicable. However, yes, I think also at the same time, the left has to take wins when we get them, and you can claim, you can say, here's what we did that was really good and important, and that wouldn't have gotten done without us. And also, here's why we still need to keep pushing, and here's where we need to keep pushing.
Right. Okay. I think the Green New Deal is a good, when it first emerged, that it's a good name, and like the branding is good. I think the right sort of did do a pretty effective job at like demonizing that term in particular and making it about like they're gonna make hamburgers illegal or something like that.
You know who told me they would make hamburgers illegal was somebody who worked for Andrew Cuomo. That was like 4 years ago, I guess. There was a reporting on the climate bill in New York State, and his spokesman said, we can't get to a place where we're banning hamburgers or something.
Well, I mean, Cuomo did have a very effective communications team that helped him dominate the state for,
and he loved a right-wing GOP talking point.
A dozen
that was
years,
the big,
yeah. So I think that's a good slogan. I think probably the average American has a positive association with the New Deal. And but it is sort of like vague still in a sense. If someone hears about it, they're not quite sure what it means. And maybe the GOP was able to take advantage of that. Okay, so another slogan that emerged in 2020 was defund the police, and that has not happened, and maybe it's impossible for it to happen. How do you see that movement playing out, or what are the failures, the partial success of a green energy stuff on the federal level, and then total non-success or even reversing progress on, police brutality stuff, like Eric Adams winning, a former cop winning the mayoralty of New York City, stuff like that. How do you see that playing out? And was this messaging? Was it just more entrenched interest?
I think I think it was a lot of things. I think that the messaging piece of it was a little overemphasized. I mean, to me, it's not, you can make anything sound bad or good, and I'm not saying that it doesn't matter at all, but I think it matters less than people think it does. I don't think it's the phrase that's the problem. I think you have to just really build public support in a way that is very tedious and time consuming and frankly hard to do. And I mean, the groundwork was not there. There was this mass outpouring of rage and grief after George Floyd, and that's completely justifiable, and we know where that came from. We know why that happened and why millions and millions of people were in the street, but it was not a programmatic movement. There was not a real coherent set of demands. There was no group that was definably or obviously or everyone agreed was in charge of those protests. And that's partly why it didn't lead to any major federal legislation, and why in some ways in some cities you could say, oh, now there's been a little bit of a backlash. But The backlash is because people do think we got that done. I mean, we didn't. If you look into it, everybody, everyone who like reads anything about it sees that a few cities voted to cut funding. Most of that funding was restored or sort of, moved around. And I think it was AOC who called it fuzzy math, and that's what a lot of cities did. They said we're going to pretend to cut it here, we're going to put it back here. Police unions are enormously powerful in this country. That's not going to go away overnight. It's an organizing challenge, and so I think that in a way, the fact that there's a backlash now is evidence of the success, of at least the partial success, that people think that the left is some kind of all-powerful movement that did, in fact, slash funding from the police. And, we have to make these things a reality, but we also have to communicate with people while we're doing it and bring them along and make sure that the public support is there so that when and if we can actually enact the policy, people understand why they support it.
Yeah. I mean, from my perspective, it was, the spring, summer 2020 protests were, semi-spontaneous and basically leaderless. And, an amorphous organization called Black Lives Matter was sort of in charge, but not really. And so it's not surprising that a inchoate mass movement that sprung up quickly, is not like protesting various slogans and stuff like that, or maybe quickly fades away. But yeah, I think defund the people. So like I said, Green New Deal, I think is a good slogan, and they've had some partial success. Whereas I think defund the police is a bad slogan, because I don't think the average person, well, it's any slogan you have to like clarify after the fact. Like, we're not fully defunding. We're like defunding. So that's a bad slogan. If you're like asterisk, here's the explanation. And I think the average American probably has more positive than negative feelings about the cops, or knows cops, or has cops in their family.
Well, there's a huge, just sorry to talk over you.
Sure, go ahead.
There is a huge racial divide on that, right? Like most white people do trust the police. Most Black people don't, and Black people have a lot of worse contact and worse experiences with the police in general.
Right.
Sorry, go ahead.
But a lot of, the groups that need effective, like professional, competent, non-corrupt policing are like poor people in cities. Like they are the people who suffer the most from the depredations of the police themselves, and as being victims of crime and so forth. And so, like, Adams won the Black vote in the mayoral election, and he's a former cop. So I think sometimes the defund the police people are the white people who don't really have a lot of contact with the police, and if the police disappeared, their lives would not really change that much. Whereas if the police disappeared from a lot of like cities, then things would change. And there's a lot of Black people who think they would change for the worse if if
there were no police presence
cops
at all. Right. And I think that is the organizational challenge, is like, how do you talk to your neighbors in a way that draws out what they think first and foremost, talk to the people in those areas and see what they want. But I think what most people want, Black, white, wherever they live, is to feel safe in their homes, on their streets, and in interactions with police officers, right? And those don't have to be in conflict. Those don't have to be irreconcilable goals as a society. We can have all of those things. We should have all of those things. And right now, the only association in most people's minds with public safety is, cops, right? And so that's part of what you have to figure out, is how do you help people see, how do we help each other see that there's a way that doesn't involve sending armed patrols into certain neighborhoods, that there's a way that we could have public safety without that. I would just, and I totally hear your point about defund, and I've had actually a lot of these conversations, so I have a lot of sympathy for that. But at the same time, I personally would defend the slogan just on the basis of being pretty clear. I mean, part of why there's these asterisks and people sometimes have to say, well, that's not really what I meant, is that there's an internal division within the movement, right? Some people really do mean, I don't want police. I want a world without police. And some people just mean, I want better police. I want cops who are better trained and more humane or whatever. I'm much more on the side of, I don't want police. I mean, I want a world where people are safe, but we don't have police, but we're nowhere near that world, right? It's a very far away world right now. And that's the point. That's like how you don't get there overnight. You have to kind of like build in the direction of that world. So first you have to be on the same page about what the actual demands are, I think, before you decide about slogan. But to me, it's not, again, I mean, I'm not attached to the words in terms of like, oh, I would never vote for someone who didn't say defund. I don't think that's an important line to draw. I just think we have to be clear about what we want and what we think is reasonable, what we can get. And there's always a dual track on the left, right? There's always, what do you want in the long term, best case scenario? You can wave a wand and have the world we want. And what are the intermediate steps we can take to get there? What are we willing to settle for, I guess, right?
Right. I mean, another slogan that I think is a good slogan is Medicare for all. And because that's easy to understand because everyone knows what Medicare is. And, you know, like for a long time, like single payer was the term. And even as a college graduate, I didn't understand what that meant. I thought it meant like single payer, like I'm the one paying, like, or something like that. So Medicare for all is a much improved slogan and rallying cry in that respect. At the same time, Medicare for all seems extremely difficult to make happen. Whereas defund the police, I think, is a bad slogan and also extremely difficult to make happen. So you would want sort of like, you know, if you're chasing a dream that is like, you know, going to be extremely difficult, you want to make it something that at least, you know, more than 50% of the people agree with. And I don't think more than 50% of Americans want to defund the police because, yeah, the average person likes the cops, I think, you know.
I mean, that also depends on how you ask the question. Like all of these things, it's really depends a lot on the framing. And people will say, well, I don't think, I think the police budget should be 3 times the budget for public education in our city? No, I don't think that. So,
right. I mean, you know, I think Biden explicitly said we're not defunding the police, and I think he said we're going to fund the police or refund the police, or something like that.
Yeah.
And I mean, the real thing is, like, I feel, so, from my opinion, cutting through both sides, the real thing is you want effective policing. You want cops who are preventing crime and tracking down and arresting criminals who have committed a crime, and that probably means, unfortunately, like, you need to hire better people to be police officers, and they need better training, and they need to not be trained to like reach for their gun at the first moment. So you need like a better class of people coming in to be a cop, because like I think
that's Bernie's position, right? I mean, I think Bernie is not a defund the police guy, and what he has said pretty consistently is we need to pay police more, and they should have a college degree. That's what he believes. I actually don't. It's a rare point of disagreement between me and Bernie, and I don't want cops. I don't think they're good. I think ultimately we should have a world where we don't have to arm a small number of people to quote unquote keep order in certain neighborhoods. I mean, I understand why that's the only way that people think about it right now, but that's sort of not my ultimate vision. And that's a division on the left between people who see a way of really overhauling and really improving the police, and people who just really don't want police and want to keep each other safe, keep their own communities safe. I mean, those are tough questions and conversations. I will say, though, really quickly on the police point, that police almost never stop crime while it's happening, right? What they do is, in theory, is you report it to them and they go and try to find the guy after the fact. So this idea that somehow you're more vulnerable, you know, let's just say as a woman, I'm going to be raped because when was the last time the police stopped a rape? I mean, it's very, very, very rare. You're attacked, you have something terrible happen to you, and then you call them, and maybe they help you, maybe they don't, or maybe they help you years later. You know, it's just.
Yeah, I mean, I think the standard level for police, I mean, it's so complicated. So one issue is America has more guns than humans,
right?
And absent some massive cultural change, this is going to be
Right.
the case for decades. And we're a gun crazy society, and it's like a national mental illness that we love guns more than we love people. So law abiding citizens and criminals alike have guns often on their person. So
Mhm.
any agent of trying to like break up any like dispute that's happening or something, they're going to want to have a gun too, because the people in the dispute very likely have a gun. And this leads to a lot of problems. So it's like the wide availability of handguns in America is sort of the root of this issue. And if I could snap my fingers and all handguns disappeared, then that would be a much better life for America. But like gun confiscation is never going to happen. And I
Right.
think it will take some sort of cultural change of being like, oh, these things are horrible. And it'll, yeah, I mean, I saw a headline today about a man who was killed because he was driving with his hunting rifle in the car and his dog in the car, and the dog stepped on the rifle, shot the man in the back, and he died instantly.
Oh,
um
Jesus.
so that's America. Dogs are killing their owners with guns. Like, we're such a gun crazy society, and I think this is horrible. But it's, as long as that is the case, the cops are going to have guns. And in most of, in Europe, people don't have handguns, and so
Right.
the cop could just have a billy club or something, and
Right.
that's enough. So that's one issue. I mean, sort of the other is like, the real problem with the cops, like globally, is either the cops are incompetent, corrupt, or are criminals themselves. So in, country X, a crime has been committed against you. What do? If you go to the cops, maybe the cop's brother is the one who committed the crime, and the cop is covering for his brother, or the cop wants $100 to even take your statement because he's on the make, or he's just a lazy guy who sits in his office all day long and never does anything. So those are all bad. And like the weird problem in America is like, our cops are doing too much in some instances, like
Right.
chasing people who don't need to be chased and then shooting at them. Whereas, in some developing country, the cops are just like essentially an armed gang or something, and they extort money from the
Right.
populace. So that's bad too. And, and that like state of affairs may be like, it's be sort of like how some people in Afghanistan prefer the Taliban, because at least they sort of like meted out justice, versus the the
Yeah.
corrupt Afghan state that America helped build, that didn't do anything at all, and just like would shake people down for money and stuff like that. So it's like, well, at least the Taliban will, like, if someone is raped, maybe the Taliban will like go and kill the rapist or something. um no, just that's like some sort of rough justice that's being meted out or something, whereas the
Right.
corrupt police are not doing anything at all, or actively stealing committed crimes. So like, we don't have that problem in America, and that we're somewhat lucky that we don't have that problem. But we have this whole other suite of problems. I don't know. I think you're inevitably going to have some armed officers of the state that are interacting with people a lot. And if those people were like better trained and better paid and taught how to de-escalate situations better or something, it's a very thorny problem. So
Hey,
yeah.
I'd take it. I mean, I'd take if we actually did any of that, I'd be delighted. But where the like decades of reform efforts have really clearly failed, right? I mean, there've been since the 60s, there's been pressure to train them better, to do more diversity on the force, have raised the requirements for becoming a police officer, and that really hasn't worked. So I think that, I mean, that's where a lot of that rage came from
Hmm.
in the summer of 2020.
Hmm. Okay, let's so your book came out before the election, and how did you see the individuals and sort of the groups and forces that you've talked about playing out in this past election? And especially one person almost surprised you didn't mention it, maybe he just wasn't really on the scene yet, was Fetterman, um, who
Y-
seems like the closest. He's not squad, and he's not a socialist, but he's sort of the
No.
closest thing, and he's in the Senate now and will be for 6 years. Um, and did have a lot of, I don't know, he seemed to, in his person, merge populist, um, left, and also just because he's this hulking, like scary looking guy, he couldn't be tagged as like some weak on crime, effete liberal sort of thing. And he beat, of course, Dr. Oz.
Right.
Yeah. So how did you? What did you think about how things played out in the last election?
I mean, it was pretty exciting. It was much better than anyone on the left, very broadly speaking, and including just sort of mainstream Democrats. I think way better than anyone on the left could have hoped is how those elections went. Fetterman specifically, I think he lucked out in terms of his opponent, who was just a uniquely unlikable, ridiculous figure.
Yeah.
Who had no connection, no real connection to the state or the people in it. That was certainly helpful. I mean, they put up this sort of slate of absolute cretins on the Republican side, like people with no social. I mean, speaking of candidate quality, right? I think that was a real problem for them that they had. Was it Blake Masters in Arizona, who's basically like a creepy robot, and just a bunch of obvious psychos.
Yeah, and the guy in Georgia, the former football player, his name is escaping right now, who did
Herschel Walker.
Right. Herschel Walker, who was like one of the worst, personal candidate biographies.
I mean, Herschel Walker, who I say this in all sincerity, I think may actually be brain damaged from years on. I mean, years of football. We know what that does to a brain. Like it's not good, and he didn't seem quite competent or able to even be there. So they picked uniquely bad candidates. That was helpful.
And that was Trump. I mean, those people were all Trump endorsed. And were somewhat in the Trumpian mold, especially Dr. Oz as a reality TV huckster.
Right. Exactly.
With no previous political experience. And the fourth one of that bunch would be J.D. Vance, who unfortunately did win. But those four were all sort of the Trumpiest. I guess Carrie Lake, but she was running for governor. They were sort of the Trumpiest candidates, and most of them lost. So that was good. So yeah.
And abortion. I think abortion did help.
So that was a huge thing as well as the abortion ruling. But there wasn't like and you can't expect this every cycle. There wasn't like an AOC like figure or a Bernie like figure that really people on the left were rallying around, or was there?
I mean, I think you're right that the closest to that was Fetterman, who's sort of in some ways a Bernie crowd, although I don't think he would embrace the label, and he kind of backed off on certain associations with Bernie. But people learned a lot from Bernie, whether they credit him for what they learned or not. It's clear who took notes on his campaign. I mean, I actually think Fetterman's a lot of his appeal was just that he seems like a regular guy, right? He walks around in those silly cargo shorts or whatever, and he's not like not putting on airs, doesn't project an attitude of I'm better than you. Just seems like some guy in your neighborhood or something. And people like that, I mean, they like that. They kind of project that onto Trump, which is so weird because he's such a strange, he's so obsessed with being rich and with gold-plated this and that. And he does clearly think he's better than people, but still people have this perception of him as down to earth. And I think that's partly because he says what he thinks, right? No matter how crazy it is or how poorly thought out. And there's something to that authenticity. And that's not even that no side has a monopoly on that, really. Like with the right has those people too, that if you can seem folksy and approachable, and also like you're saying what you actually think in the moment, those are big advantages.
Right. Let's see. So in the last chapter of the book, you talk about India Walton, is that her name?
Yes. Yeah.
Who ran for mayor in Buffalo, which is where you're from.
That's
right. And can you tell her story and what lessons can be taken from the fact that she did not become the mayor of Buffalo?
So a lot of things happened in that race. India Walton is somebody I would describe as being a really great candidate in the way we've been talking about for the last few minutes about, she's from Buffalo, born and raised there. Her family's there. She has that authenticity. She has that compelling life story. She was very young, became a mother very young, I believe at 14. and,
Hmm.
raised kids on her own and really understood the struggles of everyday struggles of a lot of people in that city. Buffalo has very high poverty rate, has an extremely high child poverty rate, a lot of problems in the city that she was able to really speak directly to.
Mhm.
So I
And she
think
had no, like, she had never run for anything before, or like
she had not. No,
she
she
was
was a first
essentially
time
a
candidate.
regular person who was
Yes. Yeah.
challenging the sitting mayor who had been there like 3 terms.
Right. And I'm not sure exactly of the whole timeline of this, but I mean, she certainly had institutional support from the Working Families Party. I don't know if they actually reached out to recruit her or how exactly she decided to run, but she did have those traits and this really just a really compelling personal story. Now, what happened in the race is that she won the primary. It was really shocking to a lot of people. Uh, Nobody saw it coming. I was shocked actually that she won the primary. It's a very low turnout primary. People really didn't bother to vote. So that's I mean, which is partly how AOC won as well, right?
Mhm.
If it's a low turnout race, you only have to swing, a couple hundred people or 1,000 people, whatever it is. That's a much easier thing. Then in Buffalo, what almost always happens when you win the Democratic primary is that you win the general because it's a Democratic town, it's a union town. And that's just historically how it's always worked. What happened in this case is that the incumbent, Byron Brown, who is still the mayor now, Buffalo's longest serving mayor, he took a lot of Republican money. He colluded with a bunch of Trump Republicans, and they did everything they could. They did all sorts of dirty things to try to bury her in the general. What first he tried to get a third party line. He tried to get an independent ballot line, even though he had missed the petition deadline for that. He tried to get a Trump judge to rule in his favor. The guy did rule in his favor, and then it was overturned on appeal. All of these sorts of things that if a left wing candidate did, the Democratic Party would say this is, I can't believe they're doing this and it's so awful and they're disrupting democracy or whatever. They did all of that stuff. Ultimately, he dropped off like thousands of stamps, rubber stamps to people's homes so that they could because he had to run as a write-in candidate. So they were able, apparently that's legal under New York state law. So that everybody got these stamps and they just
Hmm.
went and they stamped the thing. Now, Byron Brown also, machine politician, been there for a long time. He controls a lot of jobs in City Hall. And people said, were pretty explicit, I have to vote for this guy because he controls my job. Or, I mean, he controlled a certain number of people directly or indirectly via their employment in municipal jobs.
Mhm.
That's part of what happened. A lot of stuff happened in that race. It was a crazy and fascinating race, but ultimately he triumphed in the general election, but he really had to work a lot harder than he was planning to work to pull that off,
Mhm. Okay, so yeah, so like a machine politician was sleeping on a unknown challenger in the primary. She comes out of nowhere, defeats him, and then he throws everything possible
Mhm.
to win in the general. I didn't hear about the stamps. That's really interesting. Um, but yeah, so he kept it, and then I wonder, well, what were the lessons for the left or insurgents or someone who wants to knock off another like machine standard issue Democrat somewhere in the country? AOC did it.
Right.
I guess because Crowley gave up, whereas Brown decided to fight.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. I think Crowley did just resign himself to which actually I give him some small amount of credit for. I mean, he just stepped aside. A lot of these people don't do that. They really go out fighting. I think
Right.
Crowley was on some level relieved that he could take a higher paying job. I mean, you're just going to cash in as a lobbyist.
That's one of the strange things about these people who want to stay in Congress for
Yeah,
life is
it is.
it seems like a miserable job, like so fucking boring. Like when they were showing the roll call over and over again of voting for McCarthy, like all the Democrats just had to sit there and say Jeffries,
Right,
like
right.
over and over and over again, just sitting in this large room hours upon hours. It was like no wonder no one wants to do this. It's like tedious nonsense. Okay, but
I
what
mean,
were the things that Walton like could have done differently, should have done differently, like,
I
or
do
was it just
think
like the machine power was too much?
well, what I would say 2 things. One is that it's going to be a lot harder now. I think I say in the book that now they've seen us coming, right? So they understand how AOC won. They understand kind of how India Walton won the primary, and that's much harder to overcome when they know, when they have a heads up and they are able to marshal all of the forces and find all of the Republican donors and call up all the rich people in the Democratic Party and say, what are we going to do? Much harder to beat that. The other thing I would say is that, yes, I do have some, minor criticisms of the Walden campaign. And I think that it behooves anyone who's seeking office to really at least have a good lawyer who understands what the hell, New York election law is extremely, extremely arcane and weird. And there's all sorts of bizarre, eccentric pieces to it. It's not, and there's all kinds of ways to keep someone off of a ballot or to outmaneuver them in that way. I don't know why they didn't, there are a few things they could have done that they didn't do. They didn't get, I might be misremembering some of this, so I take it with a grain of salt, but there was something to do with the WFP, Working Families Party ballot line. They hadn't gotten it for her because, she wouldn't have had any other way to mount a challenge to him, really, if she had lost the primary. So I think they could have been better prepared on their end. And also, everything that they did to discredit her, we could have seen coming and we should have seen coming. I mean, there was tremendous amount of mail about how she hates the police. She was going to defund the police, even though she never said that. He ran television ads, which was Byron Brown surrounded by 24 cops in uniform. That's the kind of thing that you could imagine that they might do. And I don't know that we had a really effective, I keep saying I wasn't part of the campaign in any way, but so I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm being unfair. It's quite possible they had all of those discussions and really just did the best they could. But I think that now that we know the playbook on both sides, the left needs to get a little bit smarter about anticipating some of these things.
Mm-hmm.
She couldn't, I mean, it's in no way her fault that the Buffalo News adopted a frankly racist animus towards her or her campaign and ran like several racist trash articles about how she once knew somebody who once was arrested on a drug charge. I mean, that the press was really kind of shocking. The local press, their role in that race was shocking.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to beat the establishment, especially, I mean, a total outsider trying to beat the establishment. If you had to bet on one side, you're going to bet on the establishment. They have a lot more power and influence. And yeah, just playing the inside game, having the best possible lawyer to navigate the intricacies of election law, that's hard for an outsider to do, to know who if it's your first time running for office, you don't know who the best election lawyer in Erie County is. So there's, stuff like that.
And you don't know how getting on the ballot works. I mean, that stuff is deliberately confusing, and they make it obscure for a reason.
Yeah. New York State does seem to be one of the worst in terms of this stuff and often they have maybe they're changing this, but the Super Tuesday or whatever, the presidential primary would not be the same day as the local elections primaries because they want low turnout. So they'll all get reelected, and it's a super corrupt. New Jersey, where I live, may beat it in terms of political corruption, but New York State is very corrupt as well. Okay, we're maybe going towards the end of our time, but I did want to ask you. There's another figure out there who I think you mentioned once or twice in the book, but this is maybe an alternate path that young people, millennials and younger, could take, and that would be Mayor Pete Buttigieg, current transportation secretary. And there was a time in 2019 where Buttigieg had a moment or something, and a lot of police people online were we need to devote all of our effort to taking this guy down, and he can't be seen as the teacher's pet who would ask for homework or something, or he's and all the stuff about his time at McKinsey and so forth. But there's a lot of people, especially people who are not millennials, who see Mayor Pete or Transportation Secretary Pete and say, well, this is a nice young man. He's very clean cut. He's very smart. He's very well spoken. He's married and has small kids. likable guy. Maybe this is where we should put, maybe this is the next generation, not these crazy socialists. This nice young man who went to Harvard. What do you think about
I mean,
that?
I think in every cycle we have a Pete Buttigieg. There's always some young person, young shiny person who's often based on identity, right? I mean, his whole thing was, I'm sort of progressive because I'm gay. I'm a gay American, and somehow that makes me progressive, which is not, because we are so trained to think of the left in these terms of like, oh, the left means you're pro women and pro people of color and pro gay. And it does mean all of that stuff, but it doesn't mean that everybody who has one of those pieces of identity is a leftist, right? And so I think he was doing that sort of fake progressive, like, and he was very much, I mean, very clearly doing a weird imitation of Obama. I mean, down to the cadence, right? He
Hmm.
studied his speeches, he was doing the Obama pauses, he was doing Obama metaphors, and he just wasn't as good at it as I mean, Obama was the original I'm a young guy who's talking in a progressive sounding way, and I do represent a sort of new hope and a new thing in terms of I'd be the first Black president. He was the first Black president, and that was compelling at the time in all kinds of ways. But Obama was not a leftist either. And I mean, that's sort of it depends on what you want, right? If you're just a mainstream Democrat and you think someone can win, I would say in the case of Obama, you were totally right. In the case of Pete Buttigieg, you were evidently not right. He did very, very, very badly with likely Black voters who are an important constituency for the
Hmm.
Democratic Party, obviously. So, if you want just a candidate who can win, sometime, Bill Clinton was that guy. He was young, he was charismatic, he sounded, at least sounded kind of different and interesting, and like he had all these cool new ideas. Also not a leftist by any definition, right? And that's not just revisionism. I mean, at the time he was not a leftist. Nobody thought he was a
Right.
leftist. So you have to look at, not just what people say, but what they do and how they vote and what their history is and who their friends are and where they get their money from. And to me, Pete Buttigieg was never remotely appealing as a candidate. But if I thought he could have won the presidency, then I would have had some sympathy for people who liked him. I never thought that he was a winner or could win, and he didn't. So, I mean, he did get himself installed as Transpo secretary, and he's doing a great job. I hear the airlines are. It's so great to fly these days, and we've got high speed trains and all. I don't know what he's doing in that role, but
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's interesting that he took that position because it is one where failures are more salient than successes.
yes.
Whereas he seems like a very calculating type of person. But although I saw something saying that he has moved to Michigan and might run for an open Senate seat in Michigan, or people are speculating that.
I believe it.
Yeah, so we might have Senator Pete soon. But yeah, but I'm thinking back to like 2019 and that the very long primary and how it was like, at least the online portion of it, it was very much like Warren versus Bernie, and then other people like rising and then collapsing, and Yang and Mayor Pete, and then there's like this war between the Warrenites and the Bernieites when they were essentially like next to each other in terms of ideology, and then who runs up the open lane is good old Joe. And, sort of after the initial couple losses, runs the table, and the whole Bernie versus Warren thing looks like just a total waste of time and energy when everyone was ignoring everyone underestimated Biden. That does seem to be a characteristic of his whole life, is that people underestimate him.
That's
But
true. I mean, how many other people lost as many times and then became I mean, he's
no,
not
yeah,
not the loser I thought he was, to put it that way.
no, okay, and then okay, so maybe the final thing: how would you, first 2 years of Biden, then we have the midterm election. How would you, as a socialist, evaluate the past years with President Biden?
Well, and I'll just amend what I just said about, I think that he won in 2020, and I'm, relieved that he did, but he won in 2020 thanks to a unique set of circumstances, right? And I don't think that without a global pandemic, without a crashing economy, I still believe that he wouldn't have won. But I'm glad. I mean, I'm not glad that the economy tanked and that there was a global pandemic, but I am glad that he won. So, the last year's been a real mixed bag. I think that um, the left was able to do some things, like you were talking about earlier, the Inflation Reduction Act, and that is not nothing. He canceled, what was it, $10,000 of student debt. That's not great, but it's not nothing.
But all of those things, it was tooth and nail, and like canceling
That's
the
right.
debt. It's now going to be before the Supreme Court. Like anything, any major change in America because of our politics and our sclerotic, crazy constitutional system from 200 plus years ago, like trying to get anything done is difficult.
Right, right. And I'm very frankly, just on a personal level, and it's not just me, obviously. It's not just me who's affected by this, but I'm pretty angry that the party went with a guy who not only has never been a champion of abortion rights, but in fact is responsible in a lot of ways for Clarence Thomas being on the court. So, and anybody who read about those hearings, watched them in real time, knows what he did and didn't do. He made a lot of backdoor deals with the Republicans. He suppressed testimony from people who would have supported what Professor Hill said.
Mm-hmm.
And now we have Clarence Thomas, and we have the most right-wing court in decades, right? And he was terrible. He was always terrible on abortion, and his response to the Supreme Court ruling, Dobbs, was lackluster at best, and really not in any way adequate to the moment and to what is needed.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, overall, I'd say he's been a disappointment. Is it as bad as it would have been under Trump? Absolutely not. So in that sense,
how would you judge it against like first term Obama?
I don't know that I remember enough about first term Obama. I mean, I think they're similar, right? Obama made more explicit promises, I think, to progress.
Well, the Affordable Care Act passed. That was the main.
Yes, that
was
pass.
the main thing, and then there was also the Economic Rescue Plan and bailing out Detroit and other things related to stabilizing
Joe
the
Biden
economy.
did better than Obama on recovery money, right? He made more investments in pandemic relief than Obama made in saving the economy at that time, right? So I think that's a way in which I'm happier with Biden. But I think that's a function of history and timing, and also movements, right? Movement pressure. Obama did not feel movement pressure. And actually, that's why we have the current moment in a lot of ways, is that a lot of very young, passionate people put their hearts and souls into electing Barack Obama, and they were disappointed by him. They said, we thought you were progressive. We thought you were going to do this and that and fix all of these social problems that are now not only still with us, but worse than ever before in a lot of ways, right?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of stuff comes out of Obama and his successes and failures, and without Obama, there's no Trump, I think. And
that's right.
Without Trump, probably Biden does not get back into the race, or does not run at age 72 or whatever. So there's a lot of weird contingencies. I think even absent the pandemic, I think Biden would have won. I also think probably any of the other cast of characters would have won as well, including Bernie, Warren, Mayor Pete, Marianne Williamson, Andrew Yang. I just thought Trump was going to go down.
Marianne Williamson, you think would have won? I mean,
that would have been an
interesting, on a personal level.
That would have been an interesting, matchup for sure, because they're such opposite.
I don't know.
Personalities.
Maybe.
But I really thought a warm body with the Democrat, a D next to them, would have beat Trump. Even absent the pandemic. I was thinking this before the pandemic. I thought people were just sick of the bullshit, and they wanted to return to a less insane time.
Right.
So yeah, but that we'll never, that's an alternate history. We'll never know. But okay, is there anything else you want to say about the book or the topic in general before we wrap up?
I guess I just would say the title again, The Rise of a New Left, How Young Radicals Are Shaping the Future of American Politics. And it is available in a lot of bookstores, also directly from Verso's website. And I'm still writing for a bunch of different people. I'm working on something right now for the New Republic. And I'd also say that I'm really interested in doing more book events and hoping to be in Philly at some point, and also Baltimore and DC. And anybody who is interested in doing an event or hosting an event should please get in touch.
So we'll include the link in the show notes to the Verso. We will not include the Amazon link. We'll include the Verso link. Yeah. But Twitter or personal webpage or anything else you want to point people towards to follow your work?
Sure. I finally have a grown-up website. It's just RainaLipsitz.com. So it's pretty easy to find. And my contact information is on there. It's just RainaLipsitz@gmail.com.
Okay. And are you on Twitter or?
I am on Twitter. All the professional advice I've gotten ever has been that I have to be more on Twitter. And I just cannot make myself do it. I mean, I'm trying, but I hate it so much.
Yeah, I mean, the time may have passed where being on Twitter helps you professionally. Helpful. Yeah, there definitely was a moment, but that time may have passed. So it's really just like the hardcore dead enders, including me at this point. So I'm still on there, and that's ARYHCW. And people, people can rate this show, they can review it, they can tell their friends. So thank you, Raina, for coming on, and thank you to all of the viewers and listeners. I guess they're not viewers. Thank you to all the listeners. We'll see you again next time.
Thanks so much.